All right, so this is chapter 27, the last chapter in the modern era. And today we're going to look at Russia and Japan, kind of the last two major civilizations that we haven't touched on in a while. So as we look back over the modern era, what are some things, we're not on the board yet, but as we look back over the modern era, what are some things that have characterized this time period? Mari. Revolutions, good. Caroline, what else? Industrialization, good save. Nick. Colonization. Where?
In Africa and Asia.
Good. So colonization is an old theme because we saw that in the early modern era. But the destinations are new. We're now colonizing the Eastern Hemisphere rather than the Western. Stephen. Globalization. Would you care to enlighten us? No. Would somebody else like to tack on to? Yes, it is like the trade thing. It's a trade thing. It's a trade thing. You wouldn't understand. Somebody want to add on to globalization? It's a trade thing and expand a little bit? Trina? Good. So we have new technology, especially in transportation, steamships, railroads, that allow faster and longer distance trade to take place, both on the oceans and on land. What else? Nick?
Technology like the refrigerator allows us to move food items to different places. Like
I don't think we're refrigerating yet.
No, refrigerating comes in the late 1800s. Yeah, they used on the railroads. They used the big ice block cars, the big refrigerator cars. They had giant ice blocks.
Okay, so commercial, not
fresh bananas from California to New York.
Okay, so commercial, not private.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, Emily? Very good. We see a growth of the areas that fall into the dependent area of global trade, the areas that only produce raw materials and sell those raw materials to the core economic nations, who always seem to be where? In Western Europe.
Or in America.
Not yet. Soon. Soon, my friend. Very soon. Right now, the United States is still more or less well, I guess by the end of the modern era, they're edging into the core.
They become more of the core.
Yeah. All right, so the last two places that we need to talk about during this era are Russia and Japan. So some things for you to think about. When we compare, and this is a four-way comparison, so this is a little bit tricky to wrap your head around. We are comparing the grouping of Russia and Japan with the grouping of the Middle East and China. Are they all equally touched or untouched by Western Europe?
No, not really.
Does Western Europe go to all these places?
No.
Yes.
They don't go to Russia.
Yes, they do. All right, so we're not talking about the degree yet. We're just simply talking, does Western Europe engage with all of them on an economic and or political level? Yes, absolutely. Do all of them Westernize? Possibly. All right, but during this era, we do not see all of them westernized the same way. Who westernizes more? Russia and Japan. Who is more resistant to westernization? China and the Middle East. Who gets colonized?
China and the Middle East.
China and the Middle East. Who does not? Russia and Japan. Who gets conquered?
China and the Middle East.
China and the Middle East. Who does not?
Russia and Japan.
The other one. Is it the glare? Now, this first one you know the answer to because it was on the reading quiz. Who has a culture of borrowing? Russia and Japan. Who has Russia borrowed from previously? Byzantium. Who has Japan borrowed from? China. Does China have a culture of borrowing or copying? Right. And does the Middle East? Right. They typically do not tend to view others as having ideas of much value, especially when those ideas come from the West. We're going to skip previous relationships because I want to. Strength of government. How would you compare the strengths of the governments in these places? You're on hold. You're on hold. Emily. Okay, so as a starting place, we typically think of China and the Middle Eastern empires as well as having very strong centralized governments. We typically think of Japan, at least the last time we were there, as having been far more fragmented and having more of a feudal system. And even when they were united under the shoguns, you still have those feudal kingdoms that are warring with each other. And Russia has been kind of hit or miss. I mean, they've been unified under the czars, but it's still such a vast empire that total centralization and unification has proven very difficult. What are we seeing in the modern era in terms of the strengths of Chinese government and Ottoman government? Mari? Right. In both of these places, we're seeing the government's weakening. China's weakening because of the West continually encroaching on them, plus their dynasties just seem to keep making the same mistakes over and over. And we see the same things happening in the Ottoman Empire. It's gotten too big. The Janissaries have proven to be too much of a hindrance. And there's still far too many people that would rather have a traditional historical culture than they would embrace the ideas of the 19th century. So what we want to look at today is, where do Russia and Japan fall into that mix? Do they fall into the mentalities of the Chinese and the Ottomans? We don't want anything to do with the West. They suck. They're stupid. Nothing good ever comes out of there. Or do they go a different route? So today we're going to start with Russia. So, quick recap. If you forgot where Russia is, there's Russia. It's big. It's the largest country on the planet in terms of square mileage, or square kilometers for those folks in the metric system. We try not to make fun of them too often. This map takes you all the way up through 1914, which is the end of the modern era. This is a lot of territory. This is massive. Sahil? Right. It's not like this is densely populated from border to border, north to south, east to west. You're right. And there are large pockets, especially up here, where it's relatively uninhabited. And so you're more taking this territory for its resources and periodically sending people there to get the stuff and then come back as quickly as possible before you freeze. You're right. Right. Or you send the people there that you don't like and be like, haha, you're going to freeze. Siberia was a great open-air prison. You didn't need walls, you didn't need fences, you didn't need guards. You just drop them off the train and be like, I would stay inside if I were you, because, you come outside, you'll die. Plus there's polar bears, you know. Right. All right, so as we look at Russia, we first have to start with Napoleon. What's the connection between Napoleon and Russia? Stephen. What's that? Napoleon invaded Russia. With what outcome or consequence for the Russians? He lost, but what was the impact or the consequences for the Russians? Okay. All right, it's a good start. How else does Napoleon impact Russia when he invades? We know he loses. We know how the story ends. But once he's gone, what's the impact on Russia? You what? They do or they don't? All right. You have a number of people in Russia that because of Napoleon's invasion don't want Westernization. Anything associated with Napoleon must be, by definition, bad. Napoleon came from the West, ergo the West is bad, ergo Western ideas are bad. Plus there was that whole French Revolution thing. Also bad. Also bad. What else? What happens to how the Russians view themselves when Napoleon invades? Who thinks they're stronger? Oh, the Russian army doesn't think they're stronger because they recognize the only reason they won was because they ran away until winter killed Napoleon, or at least killed his army. And therein actually lies the answer. Mari? Good. The Russians come to realize that they need to Westernize, whether they like it or not, because they just got their butts whooped by Napoleon, and the only reason they didn't get conquered outright was because they ran away and burned all their stuff and let winter do the dirty work for them. Am I driving you crazy yet, Nick? Go ahead.
Napoleon's invasion occurred before industrialization. So how is he industrialized?
It did not occur before industrialization. Industrialization begins in 1750. Now, it doesn't hit its stride until the mid-1800s. There are actually two industrial revolutions. The second one creates more of the changes that we typically associate with industrialization. But the ball is already rolling during the time of Napoleon.
Napoleon was using the same weapons the Russians did, much quicker than Canada.
Because the Industrial Revolution starts in England. But it comes out of England to its closest neighbors first, and to its colonies, which is why the United States and France get a jump start on industrializing. Now, Napoleon's invasion doesn't convince the Russians they need factories and assembly lines and railroads, because you're right, they don't have that yet. Napoleon didn't either. But it does show them that they have fallen behind the Western nations. Napoleon's tactics were better. He had better equipment on average. The Russians did have some of the same weaponry, but they didn't have as much of the really good stuff. Sometimes they were making do with much older models. That's actually going to be true of the Russian military for the next several wars in a row. They always seem to have last year's stuff, or the last war's stuff. Trina? Yep. And this is where the... Go ahead.
When did they stop having last war stuff?
No, because even after World War II and you get into the Cold War, we build the atomic bomb, then they build the atomic bomb. Then we build the hydrogen bomb, then they build the hydrogen bomb. So it's probably not until 60s or 70s that they start to produce stuff that nobody else did. So like with Sputnik, that was obviously the first space age technology that anybody had. You could even make an argument for the AK-47 being finally something that the Russians had that was better. Okay, but I mean as far as the rest of the West by that point, especially compared to American military technology, given that Americans really didn't like the M16 as much as they liked the AK-47. But up until you get to the 60s and 70s, Russia just seems to always be behind. And so what this does, heading to the second point, is it makes Western ideas, and by association Western wealth, seem very attractive. You kind of have this perception, if you're outside of Western Europe, looking in, you have this perception that, oh man, everybody in the West is rich. They all have nice houses, they all have nice clothes, they all have cool stuff. Man, everybody there just must be awesome. It's kind of the viewpoint that some people have of the United States today. The whole streets are paved with gold, and there is opportunity and wealth to be had, and everybody can get rich. Now, when you live there, you realize that's not always the case. But from the Russian perspective, the West seems to have it all going on. But it's still the West. And we don't want to copy just to copy. Because one of the things we're still holding on to is serfdom. Even though Western Europe has abandoned not only serfdom but also slavery, Russia is still very much clinging to serfdom. And they do it for two reasons. One, because it makes them wealthy. And two, because they feel like they owe it to the peasants to take care of them. What we mean by paternalism is the Russian nobles feel like they are the parents of the peasants. That these poor, stupid, dirty, ignorant, uneducated peasants couldn't possibly take care of themselves. They can barely get out of bed in the morning without hurting themselves. Without nobles to tell them what to do, what would these poor, stupid, dirty, uneducated peasants do? They'd probably sit in mud and not even be able to feed themselves because they're so dumb. That's kind of the Russian noble view of the Russian peasant. These people are so dumb they couldn't possibly live without us telling them what to do. We are doing them a favor by forcing them to work for us. Basically, we're saving their lives. We're saving their lives because they're too dumb to have freedom. They can't be trusted with it. How do you think that plays out with the peasants? Do you think the Russian peasants are like, oh, we love nobles. Thanks for making us serfs. Thank you. This is fantastic. Best thing ever. We are too dumb to think for ourselves. Thank you, thank you, thank you, nice Russian nobles, for making our lives so easy. No. They're angry. Do you have a question, James?
I'll say it's like a rebellious teenager.
Yes. It's actually very, very similar to a rebellious teenager. Parents are convinced they know the best thing to do. The teenager is equally convinced their parents are stupid. Now, except in this case, it's obvious that the parents are right all the time. Really? Nothing? Nothing? No comment? Wow, okay. But in this instance, the Russian serfs are on a very, very different page than the Russian nobles. Now, also, in trying to wrestle with this whole, do we westernize, do we not? There are a number of people in Central and Eastern Europe that feel like the West really isn't as great as they think they are. And so they come up with this new entity called the Holy Alliance. Russia, Prussia, and Austria decide they are going to culturally and ideologically band together are going to band together in defense of true European Christian values. They kind of see themselves as the last bastion of sensibility and morality. And they see the rest of Western Europe as the rebellious teenager, going off and experimenting with all these fancy newfangled ideas and all these new modern inventions, and they're losing sight of tradition. They're losing sight of their culture. They're losing sight of history. Silly Western Europe. They're going to go have their early life crisis. They're going to go have their fling with modernity. And then they're going to come crawling back to tradition, and we're going to be there to welcome them back and be like, oh, you silly child. I realize that all went by pretty quick. If Russia is viewing themselves as kind of the cultural safeguard of Europe, that Russia is the right way and the West is the wrong way, do you think that's an accurate perspective? If we were to take an objective look at Europe as a whole in the modern era, do you think we could objectively say, yes, Russia is doing everything right and Western Europe is doing everything wrong?
No.
Other than Nick.
No.
Right. So right away we just have to look at the scoreboard, and Western Europe is beating them in direct military conflict. So clearly they're doing something right. James?
Well, we could probably look at like the past, because like they keep on evolving and evolving, keep
Mhm.
moving forward. Unless of course moving forward means going down to a spiral and do things like
Very good. And that's really the only argument that Russia can make. Because again, if you go to the scoreboard, who's richer? The West or Russia? The West. Who has more new inventions? The West. Who has a higher quality of life? The West. Who doesn't have serfdom? The West. Who has more overseas colonies? The West. Who has better military technology? The West. Russia? So really the only way you can make this argument if you're Russia is if you can convince yourself that all of the things that the West are doing, like James said, are actually leading you on a downward spiral. The only way you can convince yourself that you are right and this holy alliance is a good idea is if you can genuinely say, man, all these new inventions are going to lead to your own destruction. All of this wealth is ultimately going to come back to burn you. All of this conquering and imperialism and colonization, that's all going to come back to do far more damage in the end. That's the argument Russia's trying to make with this holy alliance. That's the argument they're trying to make with sticking to tradition. Yeah. We're still waiting for it. So what we find in Russia is that Russia is trying to remain very, very conservative. So when we look at that politically, if you are politically conservative, what form of government do you prefer? Monarchy, because it's what Europe's always had. If you're in Russia, who's in charge? The Tsar. And if you're the Tsar and you want to maintain political tradition, you have some great techniques to help you do that. Secret police. That way, if anybody starts rebelling, if anybody starts standing up in public squares in major cities and saying, down with the Tsar, he's corrupt, he's abusive, blah, 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 you have the secret police go to his house in the middle of the night, and the next morning, guess what? There's no problem anymore. And then all the 100 people that were at the last meeting are like, oh, crap. Yeah, we're good. We don't have any problem at all. We like waking up in the same bed that we fell asleep in. I don't want to go to Siberia. Please don't make me go. Now, sometimes it's just as simple as censorship. You control what the newspapers print. You tell the editor, no, you will not print that story. Because if you do, guess who's going to the gulag? You. Oh, okay. I won't print that. And you know what? I have a great story here about how awesome the Tsar is. I think I'll print that one instead. Good idea. Good idea. Nick.
Why is Russia seem to never get away from that thing with the secret police and censorship? They did it through the Tsars, they did it through the communists, and technically they're still doing it to a lesser extent today.
Well, it's not just Russia. I mean, you see this in places in Africa, you see it in places in Central and South America. You see this in any place where you don't have total transparency and openness, and places where the people have greater political power. Because this is the best way if you are going to maintain some sort of dictatorship or autocracy or whatever. The best way to keep that is to not let people complain. As soon as you open it up to allowing other people's opinions, typically the first opinions people are going to offer are, we don't like your opinion, we want a different one. And so now you have two choices. If you are an autocratic ruler, if you are a dictator, if you are a all-powerful czar, option one is allow other people's opinions, which means they're not going to listen to you. Or option two is get rid of anybody else with a different opinion. One is going to lead to a much more equitable society. The other is going to let you keep your power. Now guess what? People that have total power already like to keep total power. It's kind of addictive. They don't like to share. Could argue. But what's also interesting is the number of people in Russia that seem to like that. That are comforted by the fact that they only have one person that has any real authority. And what's funny is this works. You never see a French Revolution style rebellion in Russia during this time period. It doesn't happen. Between the secret police and the censorship, anybody with any significant difference of opinion is either smart enough to keep his mouth shut or dumb enough to open it and get sent off to Siberia in the middle of the night. And so Russia does not see the kinds of revolutions that France does, or the United States does, or Latin America does. Russia's exempt because of this autocratic form of government. I mean, it makes you wonder how things would have played out differently here if the British response would have been to take Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, and George Washington out back and shot them. What's that, John Hancock? Thomas Paine, I'm sorry, you said what about common sense? Anybody else? No? Oh, I'm sorry, you said you love being a colony? Okay.
Did the British realize that mistake they made and did it in other colonies when they tried to rebel?
Sometimes. But sometimes people aren't threatened enough by that. Sometimes new leaders just keep popping up and you can't get rid of them. But in Russia, this works. You didn't have enough people that were willing to continually risk violence or exile. But you also see this same system hurt their development. Because with that autocratic style of government, I mean, your default mindset is, we don't want to change. The whole reason you're persecuting all of these rebels, all of these revolutionaries, the whole reason you're persecuting them is because they want what? Change. So your default mindset as the ruler is, change is bad, because change threatens what? Right. Change threatens me. But Your Majesty, what if we don't threaten you, but what if we change the economy? What if we industrialize? Isn't that a good idea? Why is that not a good idea? Sahil? Right. Because if we westernize, who are we basing our ideas on? The West. And what other ideas does the West have? Revolution and democracy. Oh, crap. So we can't industrialize, because if we industrialize, we're opening the door to other things Western. So if we're going to keep our hold on power, if we're going to keep a hold of our society the way it is, guess what we can't do? Industrialize. But this only works so long as you're not in direct competition with the West. And unfortunately, what we see with Russia is that in the mid-1800s, it's like 1858, something like that. I could be wrong. I might just be making that up. The Crimean War does the same thing that Napoleon's invasion does, and that's why this book ends this section of the notes. The Crimean War does the same thing Napoleon's invasion does, which is it's a wake-up call. It shows them how far behind they have fallen. Because in the Crimean War, the Russians decide, oh look, the Ottoman Empire is growing weak. We would love to occupy the Ottoman Empire because it's so rich, not only in resources, but also in location. It's like real estate. Location, location, location. They are in a great spot. They control the eastern end of the Mediterranean. They control the north end of the Red Sea. This is a fantastic place to be. I apologize for the rhyme. So the Russians decide, we're just going to march down here and take it because the Ottomans are weak. The British say, no, you're not, because we don't want Russia getting any bigger. The British are coming from way over here. The Russians are going just down the block. Guess who wins? No. You would think it would be Russia because they're so close. It's like, how can you possibly lose? You are literally fighting in your backyard. You guys ever have like a water balloon fight? If you didn't, I'm sorry, you missed out. They're awesome. All right, you know how in a water balloon fight, you have to go someplace to fill up the water balloons, right? So like a spigot on the back of your house, running into the kitchen sink, things like that. Imagine the water balloon fight is taking place at your house in your backyard. You should have the clear advantage. Now imagine this is an epic, very epic water balloon fight. So you can't just stockpile at the beginning. You are going to have to make new water balloons. The other kids are coming from a half-mile away. And every time they run out of water balloons, they have to go back to their house and then come back with their fresh supply of water balloons. Who should the obvious winner be? You. You're like, wait, 1 second. New water balloon. Okay, I'm back. They have to go a half mile and come back. Right. The problem is, those kids that are going a half mile and coming back are able to make that half mile trip and come back faster than you're able to go over here, fill it up, and come back outside.
You are really late.
The British have steamships and railroads. The Russians have horses and their feet. It's not even close. It's not even close. It's not because of tactics. It's not because of weaponry. It's not because of generals. It has everything to do with industrialization of transportation. The Russians get annihilated in their own backyard. And this again serves as a wake-up call. We have to change. We don't have a choice. We have to industrialize. But we still have this same gut level reaction, but we don't want to. We don't want to be like the West. They suck. We don't like them. They're mean. Who cares if they have better stuff and they always win and they're so much richer and they have better hair? Wait, what? We don't want to be like them. We want their stuff. We want their power. We don't want to be like them. Alia? Yeah, very similar. And you're going to see this play out a lot throughout history. We want their stuff, but we don't want to be like them. I would love to have their house, but they're kind of jerks. So, Russia industrializes. They give in, they cave, kind of. Russia is going to make sweeping changes. Kind of. They are going to emancipate the serfs. That's step one. Now, why do you have to emancipate the serfs if you want to industrialize? What's the connection? Right, because they have to work. You need workers in factories. And right now, your best supply of workers are the serfs. The only way to get the serfs to work in factories is to end serfdom. So they emancipate the serfs, but not really. They grant land, free land, to all the serfs. But, right, the serfs have to pay back the value of the land to the landowner. Right. Yeah. Right. They made it worse. They made it worse because they dangled that hope. I'm going to give you a gift. After centuries of backbreaking labor and servitude and oppression, I am giving you your freedom and your own land. You are. You mean after all this time, we're free? We're free? Yes, you are free. You just got to pay me back. What? I'm sorry, what? I must have been in the middle of celebrating. Maybe I didn't hear you. I have to what? Yeah, you just got to pay me. Let me explain this to you, because apparently you're slow as the noble. I am a serf. I have no money because I'm a serf, because you jerks haven't paid me in 500 years. Oh, that's fine. Take your time. Take your time. There's no rush to pay me back. You know, whenever you pay me back, the land's yours. Aren't I such a nice guy? Oh, I've got all kinds of names to call you. Nice guy is not one of them.
You guy getting punched.
Right. So, this makes it worse. They would have been better off not emancipating them at all. Not even bringing it up, be like, no, your life is going to continue to suck as it always has been. And the serfs have been like, well, figures. But to open that door to hope and then kick it shut in their face, that was just cruel. And that is going to begin a whole new period of unrest and rebellion, ultimately culminating in the Russian Revolution in the present era, just on the other side of 1914. James, what were you going to say?
Oh, it's like with the carrot and stick. Like
Uh-huh.
You can make them nibble on the carrot, then beat them with a stick again.
Exactly. So serfs are given grants of land, but they have to pay for it. They're given their freedom, but they have no political rights. Some are even allowed to leave the rural areas and go to the cities. But in the cities, life still sucked. Because your wage in a factory was almost as low as your wage as a farmer. What this meant, though, was that Russia had a window. They had a window of opportunity where they could have made the same sort of agricultural reform that the West did. Oh, they slammed it shut. They could have said, all right, all these serfs are packing up, they're leaving, they're going to the cities. How do we fix this? How do we grow enough food? We need to invent new stuff. We need new ideas. We need new ways of doing it. No. We're going to stay traditional. We're going to do things the way that we always have. We're going to make these poor, stupid peasants that are still on the land work harder. Doesn't solve the problem, only increases resentment. Opportunity for significant change, gone. Bad decision. And again, like we've talked about all year long, this is not a series of inevitable events. History is a series of choices that people have made in a variety of circumstances, many of which are very, very similar. What have we seen almost every single dynasty in China do again and again and again? We've seen the same things happen. Why? Because it's inevitable?
Yes.
No, because they keep making the same choices.
It's inevitable that they're going to keep making the same choices.
Philosophically, I disagree. Evidence does seem to support the idea that there is a tendency to keep making the same bad choices, but it still comes down to choice. Is it inevitable that teenagers will always make stupid choices?
Yeah.
Their parents will say yes. But does it still come down to choice? Yeah. Right. Same thing for teenagers. What's easier? Well, I could listen to my parents, or I could do what sounds like more fun. I could get my driver's license and drive the speed limit, or I could do 90 in a 30.
Driving would be intense, I kill.
Emily? Yes, it would be fair to say that when you make those choices, the outcomes are already pretty well decided. You really can't make the same choices and expect a different outcome. Yeah. All right, similar developments politically. The Russian government realizes that, again, we need to dangle the carrot. We need to make people feel like they're getting more political representation. That will keep them happy. So we are going to create something called the Zemstva. This will be a local political organization, local government, where we can allow the local people to feel like they're actually having an impact in the government. We'll let them come up with, meeting ideas, and we'll let them vote on stuff, and we'll let them drop documents that says, hey, we all voted on this, and we all think it's a great idea. And then guess what the Tsar is going to do? Wah, wah. He's not going to listen. It probably won't even make it to his desk. So you've got all these local councils, all these zemstvas, that feel like they're doing great work. Like, yeah, the government's finally listening to us. They're not. How long do you think it's going to take before all those local councils realize that none of their ideas are being heard by the people in charge? Not long. And how much longer beyond that do you think before they start getting really frustrated that they're spending all this time and this effort and coming up with really good ideas and nobody's listening? Not long. So at that point, you've got two options. You can be like, oh, well, we tried, and go back home to being serfs. Or you can get rowdy. Rowdy. For rebellious? What this does do, though, is this gives the middle class experience with government. It's the same thing you saw in what will be the United States during British colonization. They allowed locals in the colonies to run local governments. It seemed totally harmless at the time. What's it going to hurt? These yokels on the other side of the ocean, will let them think they're making some laws and rules and things like that. They're not really going to do anything. Except it's valuable experience. It's practice. It's practice for the future. So that after they get all rowdy and overthrow whatever the government is, now they realize, hey, we've already done this. We know how to do this. We can pass laws. We know how to vote on stuff. We can do this.
No, they can't.
Well, they can try. Industrialization, though, I mean, it goes just as bad. They're going to build factories in Russia, but here's the problem. They don't know how to build factories in Russia. Who knows how to build factories? The West. So if you want to build a factory in Russia, guess what you need to do? Hire somebody from the West to come into Russia and build it. Does that solve your short-term problem? Yeah, you have a factory. Does that solve your long-term problem? No. You don't know how to build a factory. Plus, the Westerner that comes in to build it maintains ownership because he's putting up his money to build it. This is an investment for him. Now, there is an upside. This industrialization in Russia allows them to take better advantage of their resources. And so you see Russian production of steel, of oil, skyrocket, and Russia becomes one of the world leaders in both commodities. What does that translate to? Wealth. Significant wealth. Russia becomes richer. But what problem do you still have? Right, you don't know how to do it yourself. You're still relying on the West to help you do this. You're not doing it independently. And if you can't do it without the West's help, can you ever compete with the West? No. Nick?
If they are, why are the Europeans why do Europeans actually let Russians have factories and stuff?
Well, they don't let them have it. They build it for them and then oversee it.
But why do they even build the factories there?
Same reason that American businesses build factories in foreign countries.
Because it seems a whole lot more involved in what they're doing with Egypt in the Middle East.
It's the same concept. You are closer to the resources you are trying to use. You can get cheaper labor in Russia than you will trying to pay a Western worker. Plus, you have a very willing market within Russia for all these products. So why not move closer to where you want to sell? James?
It seems kind of ironic, like the Russian nobles who pretty much take care of the serfs because they think the serfs can take care of themselves.
Mm-hmm.
But then they go to the West to get help from them. So
Yep.
they're the kids.
Yep, absolutely. It's a great example of irony. The Russian nobles feel like they have to take care of the Russian peasants because the Russian peasants are hopeless. But then Russia can't seem to take care of itself and has to rely on the West to take care of them. Absolutely. And you see it with their middle class. England's middle class was what drove their industrial revolution. People that wanted to do things on their own. People that didn't want the government to do it for them. People that said, you know what, I'm going to go build a factory. I'm going to risk my own assets, my own income. I'm going to see if I can make it successful. In Russia, what we find is the middle class is waiting on the government. They're like, you know what, you open the factory for me, I'll work. See some of the conservative hackles arise and be like, yeah, down with the government. Now, one of the cool things that does happen in Russia, Trans-Siberian Railroad. The red and the green line span pretty much all of Russia's empire, from their Pacific coast all the way to Moscow. This is thousands of miles of railroad track. And a really sweet musical group. Nobody?
Trans-Siberian Orchestra?
Yeah. Okay.
Trans-Siberian Railroad do other than looking cool and being able to be seen from space?
Well, it starts to fix some of those same problems that the Russians had against Napoleon and in the Crimean War. It allows you to move stuff faster. But they're very slow to add on to that railroad network. Okay, last thing we're going to do today. And I know this is a lot, but hopefully this part at least is a little bit of review. Do we remember more or less what socialism is? All right, somebody explain it to me, other than Nick. Somebody explain socialism to me. All right. It's like everybody's equal in society in some respects. And who's in charge of making sure that people stay equal in some respects? The government. Now, what's the more radical version of socialism? Communism. And what happens in communism? What happens in communism? All right, complete control by the government in order to try to create complete equality. Shush. So what we're going to find in Russia is because of the huge disparity in social classes. Because the peasants are so poor, and because the aristocrats are so wealthy, you are going to see a strong desire amongst the lower class for greater equality. Now, there are a few groups you need to know. The intelligentsia. We could call them the middle class. There wasn't much of a middle class in Russia. But this relatively small group recognizes that the people need to have greater influence in the government. And this came as a result of them actually being educated. Many of them went to the West to be educated in the West's universities and then came back to Russia. Now, they are not in favor of completely overthrowing the government. They just want greater representation. They want those local councils to matter, those zemstvas. And they want to see more of that kind of involvement. Now, you got another group, anarchists. And anarchists are not unique to Russia. Anarchists can be anywhere. And wherever they are, anarchists want one thing, which is destruction of the government. No government. The belief that without government, without laws, just people living, they believe society would thrive. All right, almost like hunter-gatherer, except not even tribal councils. Just no laws, no rules, people do what they want.
Eventually someone would decide to be a leader and say, you know, I'm more powerful than my neighbors. I'm going to go and tell him what to do.
Right. Either I'm smarter or I'm stronger or I have nicer shoes, whatever. I should be in charge. Yeah. Now, in Russia, there's one other group that you need to know. The Bolsheviks. The Bolsheviks believe in a radical form of Marxism, the philosophy of Karl Marx, and they believed that a revolution needed to happen where the poor overthrew the rich and the poor people took power.
And then became the rich.
Well, and then everybody would become equal.
And so they'd kill off all the old rich people, and then they'd become the rich people, and everyone would be rich.
Because Karl Marx said, what's going to happen, because we've industrialized and we've got this working class that's so poor, what's going to happen is, at some point, the lower class, which he called the proletariat, vocab word you need to know, that at some point, the lower class, the proletariat, will rebel. They will rise up, they will attack the factory owners, and they will attack the businessmen, and they will attack the bankers, and they will kick them out of their power. And the proletariat will rule society, and the bourgeoisie, the upper class, will fall.
You know, did the French use like their revolution, but they put new people on top of
Right. This is very, very similar to what the French Revolution did, where the lower classes rose up and overthrew the nobles and the aristocrats and the king and all of that and took power for themselves. You're right. Karl Marx believed that now, if such a thing happened, that the lower class would have learned from their experience of being at the bottom of society. And they would create a utopian society where there were no more classes.
Nope.
Because the lower class would be like, yeah, being at the bottom sucks. Nobody should ever be at the bottom again. So we're not going to have an upper class. We're going to take everything that society has to offer, we're going to distribute it evenly across all people. And that way everybody will be the same. No upper class, no lower class, no middle class. Everybody's the same. Everybody has the same stuff. No greed, no selfishness, no jealousy, no rivalry, no competition. Everybody can just be the same, and we can all just get along. Emily. Communism evolves out of Marxism. Yeah. Communism just keeps the government around and says the government is going to have to be the one to distribute all of society's wealth. Paul.
Okay, but then who would like distribute everything, or decide to distribute things, or who did what job?
The lower classes, as a group, as kind of their last act before we destroyed all social classes, made everybody equal. They would be the ones that would oversee that kind of conversion. Again, it was a philosophy. It was an idea. Sahil? Middle class.
He said, my own people will be overthrown.
Well, he's especially talking about the upper class being overthrown, the very, very wealthy. All right, that's Russia in a nutshell. I realize that was a pretty big nutshell, and that took most of the class. So next class, we're going to take a look at Japan, a little bit quicker this time. And we're going to give you a chance to ask any and all questions that you want to ask about the modern era in general. But hopefully this cleared up some of the stuff about Russia.